The village of Ashenmere had learned long ago not to speak her name after sunset. Words carried weight in the dark, and some names, especially hers, were invitations written in blood. Mothers would hush their children when the wind turned cold and the moon hung like a pale wound in the sky. Fathers would bar their doors with iron and salt, knowing that neither would truly protect them if she chose to come calling. But rituals comfort the terrified, and so they performed them anyway, generation after generation, praying to gods who had long since stopped listening. Her legend was older than the village itself. Older than the crumbling monastery that crowned the eastern hill. Older, perhaps, than memory itself. She was Seraphine Nocturne, the Crimson Widow, the undying Countess, a creature of such terrible beauty that merely glimpsing her face had driven men to abandon their families, their faiths, their very sanity. But it was not her beauty that made her truly feared. It was her kiss. No man who had tasted her lips had ever survived. Not the knight who had come to slay her 3 centuries ago, his armor no protection against the hunger in her mouth. Not the priest who had tried to exorcise her with holy water and trembling prayers, only to be found 3 days later, drained and smiling in a way that made his fellow clergy refuse him burial in consecrated ground. Not the prince who had wagered his kingdom that he could resist her, nor the poet who had written 1,000 verses about loving death itself. They had all fallen. They had all died with her name on their lips and her venom in their veins, consumed by a curse so ancient that even she had forgotten its origin. Some said her kiss stole souls. Others claimed it turned men's blood to ash. A few whispered that it was not death at all but transformation, that those who kissed her were trapped forever in a twilight realm between life and death, conscious but unable to move, to speak, to do anything but relive that single perfect moment of contact for all eternity. The truth, perhaps, was worse than any of these tales. But the truth was known only to Seraphine herself, and she had not spoken it aloud in 400 years. She lived, if such an existence could be called living, in Castle Dreadmere, a fortress of black stone and darker reputation that perched on the cliffs overlooking the Sea of Sorrows. The castle had been abandoned by its human inhabitants when Seraphine had first arrived, drawn by something in the architecture that resonated with the hollow spaces in her chest where a heart had once beaten. The halls were vast and empty, designed for courts and celebrations that would never again take place. Moonlight streamed through stained glass windows depicting saints and martyrs, painting the floors and pools of red and blue and gold. Crimson candles burned in every room, hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, though no one ever saw her light them. They simply were, eternal as she was, casting shadows that moved with a life of their own. It was beautiful in the way that graveyards are beautiful. Perfect in the way that ice sculptures are perfect. And utterly, completely alone. Seraphine had not chosen isolation. Isolation had chosen her, the inevitable consequence of being unable to touch without killing, unable to desire without destroying. She had tried in the early years to resist the hunger. She had locked herself away, had starved herself until her skin became translucent and her eyes burned like coals. But the curse had its own logic, its own cruel intelligence. It would not let her die, and it would not let her rest. Eventually she had learned to accept what she was. A monster. A cautionary tale. A thing to be feared. But acceptance did not mean peace. In the long centuries of her existence, Seraphine had discovered that the worst torture was not pain but monotony. The same moon rising over the same sea. The same shadows dancing on the same walls. The same hunger never satisfied, never truly sated. She had read every book in her vast library 3 times over. She had composed music that no one would ever hear. She had painted portraits of a life she could no longer remember living. And still, time crawled forward, indifferent to her suffering. Until the night Thomas Gray came to her door. He arrived on foot, without fanfare or weapons, on a night when the fog rolled in from the sea thick enough to swallow sound itself. Seraphine heard his footsteps long before she saw him, measured, unhurried, certain. Not the steps of a man being compelled by her power. Not the stumbling, desperate gait of someone fleeing into her arms from some greater fear. These were the footsteps of someone who had chosen to be here. That alone made her curious. She watched from the shadows as he climbed the long staircase to her castle gates. He was unremarkable in every conventional sense. Average height, average build, with brown hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of autumn storms. He wore simple clothes, a gray cloak over a linen shirt, boots that had seen many roads. There was nothing about him that suggested hero or fool, saint or madman. He looked like 1,000 men she had seen before. Like no one special at all. And yet there was something in the way he moved. A quietness that went deeper than silence. A stillness that suggested not emptiness but control. He reached the gates and stopped, tilting his head as if listening to something she could not hear. Then he reached out and knocked, 3 times, polite and firm, as if this were an ordinary house and he an ordinary visitor. Seraphine materialized in front of him without warning, the way she always did with those brave or foolish enough to approach her home. Most men gasped. Some screamed. A few fainted outright. Thomas Gray simply looked at her, met her burning crimson gaze with his own steady gray one, and said, "Good evening." His voice was like his appearance, unremarkable, unmemorable. A medium range, neither deep nor high, with a slight rasp that suggested either illness or disuse. But there was something in the tone, in the deliberate calmness of it, that made her pause. Made her really look at him for the first time. "You are either very brave or very stupid," she said, her own voice pitched to resonate with the darkness itself, to crawl into men's ears and wrap around their reason. "No mortal approaches my home uninvited and leaves with their life." "I know who you are," Thomas said, unaffected by her supernatural vocal manipulation. "I know what you are. I came anyway. To die then. It was not a question. You would not be the first to seek oblivion in my arms." "No," he shook his head slightly. "Not to die. To talk." This she had not expected. In 4 centuries, no one had ever come to her castle to talk. They came to test themselves, to prove their courage, to win glory or wages or boasts. They came because they thought they could succeed where others had failed, or because they believed themselves already damned and wanted to choose the manner of their damnation. But to talk? To simply converse as if she were a person and not a plague? "I do not talk," she said, but even as she spoke, she could hear the lie in her own words. She did talk, to herself, to the shadows, to the paintings and books that filled her lonely halls. She simply never had anyone to talk back. "Then I'll talk," Thomas said. "And you can listen. That's enough." Against every instinct, every pattern worn deep by centuries of repetition, Seraphine stepped aside and let him in. They spoke in the grand hall, beneath arches that soared toward vaulted ceilings lost in shadow. Crimson candles burned in their hundreds, painting everything in shades of blood and darkness. Seraphine sat upon a throne of black stone that had been carved by craftsmen dead for 500 years. Thomas sat across from her on a simple bench, looking neither intimidated by her presence nor overwhelmed by the Gothic grandeur surrounding them. "Why are you here?" she asked, when the silence had stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. "Truly, I told you. To talk. No one travels to the castle of a monster simply to converse. What do you want from me? What bargain do you seek?" Thomas considered this, his gray eyes distant and thoughtful. "No bargain. No quest. I'm not here to slay you or save you or break your curse. I'm just—" he paused, searching for words. "I'm tired of silence. I've been walking for 3 months, ever since I left my village. And in all that time I've barely spoken to anyone. People see something in me, I don't know what, and they turn away. They answer in monosyllables. They find excuses to leave. So I heard about you, about a woman who has been alone for centuries, and I thought—" he shrugged. "Maybe you're tired of silence too." Seraphine stared at him, genuinely confused. This was not the speech of a suitor or a challenger. It was the confession of someone profoundly, achingly lonely. And despite herself, despite every wall she had built around the cold, dead thing that had once been her heart, she felt something shift inside her. Recognition, perhaps. Kinship. "What is wrong with you?" she asked, and for once her voice carried no supernatural weight, no compulsion. It was simply a question. "Why do people turn away?" "I don't know," Thomas said honestly. "I've never known. My mother said I was born quiet. Not just in voice but in presence. As if part of me wasn't entirely here. As a child, people would forget I was in the room. As an adult, they forget me the moment I leave their sight. I'm not invisible exactly. I'm just forgettable, erasable. A sketch that never quite becomes a painting. Is it magic? Seraphine leaned forward, interested despite herself. A curse. If it is, no one's ever been able to identify it. I've been examined by priests, mages, wise women, charlatans. They all say the same thing: there's nothing wrong with me. But they all forget my face before I've left the room. Seraphine understood then. Understood why he had come and why she had let him in. They were both ghosts in their own ways. Both forgotten by the world. The difference was that she had been cursed to be remembered and feared, while he had been cursed to be forgotten entirely. Two sides of the same coin of isolation. Tell me about your life, she said, surprising herself with the request. Before you started wandering. And Thomas did. He spoke in his quiet, unremarkable voice about a childhood spent in the margins of other people's lives. About parents who loved him but could never quite focus on him, their attention sliding away like water off glass. About siblings who would set the table for one fewer person than necessary, genuinely forgetting he existed until he sat down. About learning to move through the world like a whisper, making no impact, leaving no trace. He spoke without self-pity, which somehow made it worse. This was simply his reality, as mundane to him as breathing. And as he spoke, Seraphine found herself speaking too, answering his questions about her own past. The life before the curse, fragmented now like a dream half remembered. The terrible night when she had been transformed, details lost to trauma and time. The first few decades of her undeath, when she had still believed she might find a cure, a reversal, an end. They talked through the night, and then through the next day, Seraphine retreating to the shadowed corners when the sun rose, Thomas content to sit in the pools of light that made it through the stained glass. They talked about everything and nothing. Books they had read. Music they had heard. The way the moon looked different depending on the season. The mathematics of loneliness. Thomas stayed for a week. Then 2. Then a month. He made no demands on her, sought no intimacy beyond conversation. He slept in a guest room on the other side of the castle, woke with the dawn, and spent his days exploring the vast halls and extensive library. In the evenings, when the sun had set and Seraphine could move freely through her domain, they would meet in the grand hall and talk until the stars wheeled overhead and the candles burned low. For the first time in 4 centuries, Seraphine was not alone. For the first time in his life, Thomas was not forgotten. But the hunger never stopped. It was always there, a low burning in her chest, in her throat, in her lips. The curse that made her what she was demanded sustenance, demanded satisfaction. And with Thomas so close, so maddeningly, temptingly present, it grew stronger each night. She tried to ignore it. She tried to focus on their conversations, on the simple miracle of having someone to talk to. But the curse was older than her will, more fundamental than her desires. It whispered to her in moments of quiet. It made her hyper-aware of the pulse in his throat, the warmth of his skin, the way his lips moved when he spoke. "You haven't fed," Thomas observed one evening, 3 months into his stay. They were in the library, surrounded by books that chronicled forgotten empires and dead gods. Seraphine had been staring at the same page for an hour, the words meaningless beneath the roar of hunger in her mind. "I don't feed," she said, which was technically true. She had not killed anyone in over a century. The curse didn't require death, merely the kiss itself. But the hunger was worse when she abstained, a constant gnawing ache that never fully subsided. "You're suffering," Thomas said, stating it as a simple fact. "I'm always suffering. That is the nature of curses. Is there no way to satisfy it without killing?" Seraphine laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. "Do you volunteer yourself? I assure you the result would be the same regardless of your intentions." "Why?" Thomas set down his book and looked at her fully. "What exactly happens when you kiss someone?" She had never explained it before. The question had never been asked. Men came to her knowing they would die, accepting it as the price of tasting her lips. They didn't care about mechanisms or methodology. But Thomas, bless his strange, quiet soul, wanted to understand. The curse feeds on life force, she said slowly, working through an explanation she had never had to articulate. On vitality, essence, whatever you wish to call it. When I kiss someone, my lips become a conduit. The curse draws their life out through the contact, drains them until there's nothing left. It's not under my control. I can't stop it once it begins. The kiss itself acts as a trigger and then, she gestured helplessly. Then they die. Always. Every time. Have you ever tried to resist it? To pull away before it completes? Hundreds of times. Thousands. The curse has its own gravity. Once the kiss begins, neither of us can break it until the victim is dead. It's like being caught in a current. You can struggle, but you can't escape. Thomas nodded, processing this information with his characteristic quiet focus. And you feel the life being drained? You experience what they experience. Every moment of it. Seraphine's voice dropped to barely a whisper. I feel their terror, their ecstasy, their despair. I feel their hearts slowing, their breath stopping. And I cannot stop it. I can only endure it again and again, carrying the weight of every death I've caused. That's why you isolate yourself. That's why I isolate myself, she confirmed. Not because I choose loneliness. Because the alternative is becoming a serial killer. And I refuse to be that, even if I have no choice in what I am. They sat in silence for a long time after that. The candles burned. The shadows danced. Outside, the sea crashed against the cliffs in its endless, mindless rhythm. I don't think you'd kill me, Thomas said finally. Seraphine's head snapped up, her crimson eyes blazing. Do not be a fool. The curse does not care about friendship or affection. It kills indiscriminately. It has killed men I loved, men I hated, men I felt nothing for. You would be no different. Maybe. Thomas met her burning gaze without flinching. But I'm already different, aren't I? I'm the man nobody remembers. The person who barely exists in other people's minds. Maybe that matters. Maybe the curse needs someone with a normal life force to feed on, and mine? He gestured to himself. Mine is apparently so minimal that people forget I'm alive in the first place. That's speculation. Fantasy. You cannot know. You're right, he interrupted gently. I can't know. But neither can you, can you? You've never kissed someone like me before. You've never encountered anyone with my particular curse. So we're both theorizing. And if you're wrong? Seraphine demanded, feeling something that might have been fear, foreign and sharp, piercing through her. If you're wrong, you'll die. And I will have killed the first friend I've had in 400 years. Is that a risk you're willing to take? Are you? Thomas countered. Because I'm going to die eventually anyway, Seraphine. That's what humans do. But right now, I have a chance, however small, to give you something you've never had. Proof that your curse can be broken. Hope that you might be able to touch someone without destroying them. Isn't that worth the risk? No, Seraphine said immediately. No, it is absolutely not worth your life. That's not your decision to make. It absolutely is my decision. I am the one who will kill you. And I'm the one who gets to decide whether to take that chance. Thomas stood, moving toward her across the library. Seraphine found herself retreating, backing away from him, the monster fleeing the human. The absurdity of it might have been funny under other circumstances. Thomas, stop. Please. I'm not going to force you, he said, halting his advance. If you truly don't want to try, I'll respect that. But I think you do want to. I think you've wanted to for months now. I see the way you look at me sometimes, like you're starving and I'm a feast you can never taste. I see your suffering, Seraphine. And I'm telling you that I consent. I understand the risks. I accept them. Now you need to decide if you can accept the possibility, however remote, that you might not be as damned as you think you are. Seraphine did not sleep. The undead had no need for rest. But she paced through her castle that night like a caged thing, restless and afraid. Afraid. When had she last felt real fear? Not the distant, intellectual concern about her own existence, but genuine terror for someone else's well-being? The crimson candles cast her shadow long and twisted across the walls, making her look like the monster she was. She passed through halls she had walked for centuries, each stone familiar beneath her feet, each tapestry and portrait a mark of time's passage. Her castle was a monument to isolation, to the accumulated weight of years spent alone. And now Thomas was threatening to either lift that burden or make it infinitely worse. Because if she killed him, and she would kill him, there was no rational reason to believe otherwise. She would not simply return to her previous state of loneliness. She would have to exist knowing that she had destroyed the one person in 4 centuries who had seen her as something other than a monster. The one person who had sat with her, talked with her, existed beside her without fear or hunger or ulterior motive. And yet he had planted a seed of possibility in her mind, and like all growing things, it was impossible to ignore once rooted. What if he was right? What if his strange, forgettable existence meant that her curse couldn't properly latch onto him? What if, for once in her damned existence, she could experience a kiss that didn't end in death? The hope was painful. Hope always was. Hope meant vulnerability, meant opening herself to disappointment and failure. She had spent centuries carefully cultivating hopelessness, armoring herself in despair, because at least despair was predictable. Hope was chaos. Hope was dangerous. Dawn came and went, unnoticed in the shadows of her castle. Thomas, she knew, was sleeping in his guest room, peaceful and patient. He had made his offer and would not press. The decision was entirely hers. She could refuse and he would accept it. They could go back to their companionable existence, talking through the nights, maintaining the careful distance that kept him alive and her isolated. Or she could take the risk. She could damn them both with a single moment of contact. 3 more days passed. Thomas did not mention their conversation again, but it hung between them like humidity before a storm, invisible but inescapable. Their talks continued, but with a new tension underneath. Every time Seraphine looked at his lips, she thought about the kiss. Every time he looked at her, she wondered if he was thinking the same thing. On the 4th night, she found him standing on the balcony of the grand hall, looking out over the sea of sorrows. The moon was full and heavy, painting everything in silver and shadow. The wind carried the salt smell of the ocean and something else, a change in season perhaps, or simply the weight of impending decisions. "I've been thinking," Thomas said without turning around, somehow knowing she was there despite her supernatural silence, "about why your curse exists in the first place. I stopped wondering about that centuries ago." Seraphine joined him at the balcony's edge, careful to maintain a few feet of distance between them. "Curses rarely have good reasons. They simply are. But they do have purposes," Thomas persisted. "Even if those purposes are cruel. Your curse isolates you completely. It makes genuine connection impossible. That's not random. That's targeted. Someone wanted you alone. A brilliant observation that changes nothing. Maybe it changes everything." Thomas finally turned to face her, his gray eyes serious in the moonlight. What if the curse isn't feeding on life force at all? What if it's feeding on connection? On the act of intimacy itself? Every person who kisses you dies, yes, but they also form a connection with you in that moment, however brief. And the curse destroys that connection by destroying them. It keeps you perfectly, eternally isolated. Seraphine felt something cold and electric run through her. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that the curse might not work on me because I'm already disconnected. People forget me. I barely register in their awareness. So when we kiss, if we kiss, there might not be enough connection for the curse to feed on. I'm not a full person in the world's eyes. Maybe that makes me immune. Or maybe it means you'll die even faster," Seraphine countered, but her voice lacked conviction. Because what he was saying made a terrible kind of sense. The curse had always felt intelligent, purposeful. And its purpose had been isolation. But Thomas was already isolated in his own way, already forgotten. He was a blank space in the world's narrative. "There's only one way to find out," Thomas said softly. "I could lose you. You'll lose me eventually anyway. Humans don't live forever, Seraphine. I'll die in 30 years or 40 or 50 if I'm lucky. And you'll go back to being alone. Unless we try this. Unless we see if maybe, just maybe, the curse can be broken. And if it can't? If you die right now, tonight, in my arms?" Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his forgettable face into something almost beautiful. Then I'll die knowing someone will remember me. That's more than most people in my position get. Seraphine wanted to argue. Wanted to refuse. Wanted to do the safe, sensible thing and maintain the status quo. But 400 years of safety had brought her nothing but misery. 400 years of caution had left her hollow and haunted. And Thomas was right, she would lose him eventually. Time was not kind to humans. If she refused now out of fear, she would spend the rest of his natural life wondering what might have been. And then she would spend eternity knowing she had chosen cowardice over courage. "The grand hall," she said finally, her voice steady despite the trembling inside her. "If we do this, we do it properly. With all the candles lit and the full moon watching. If you're going to die, you'll die in beauty. And if I live? Then we figure out what comes next." They prepared as if for a ceremony because in a way that's what it was. A ritual of hope and desperation, performed by two people who had nothing left to lose except each other. Seraphine lit every candle in the grand hall, 1,000 flames that turned the vast space into a cathedral of fire and shadow. The moonlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the floor in pools of crimson, azure, and gold. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Thomas stood in the center of the hall, looking small beneath those soaring arches, insignificant against all that Gothic grandeur. But there was nothing insignificant about the expression on his face, calm, certain, resolved. He had made his peace with whatever was about to happen. Seraphine approached slowly, giving him every chance to change his mind, to flee, to choose life over this mad gamble. But he stood firm, his gray eyes never leaving her crimson ones. When she was close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, warmth that her cold flesh had not known in centuries, she stopped. "Last chance," she whispered. "Walk away, Thomas. Live your life. Forget this foolishness." "I don't think I could forget you if I tried," he said. "And I have no intention of trying." Her hands were shaking as she reached for him. Actually shaking, something that had not happened since she had died and been reborn as this cursed thing. She cupped his face gently, feeling the stubble on his jaw, the warmth of his skin, the pulse of blood beneath the surface. He was so alive. So terribly, vulnerably alive. "I'm sorry," she said, not sure what she was apologizing for. For this curse. For her loneliness. For pulling him into her disaster of an existence. "Don't be," Thomas said. He lifted his own hands, covering hers where they rested against his face. "Whatever happens next, thank you. For letting me exist in your memory. For seeing me." And then, before her courage could fail, Seraphine leaned in and kissed him. The world exploded. That was the only way to describe it. Not pain, not pleasure, but pure sensation, overwhelming, infinite, impossible. The curse activated immediately, just as it always did, a vortex opening between their lips, hungry and ancient and unstoppable. Seraphine felt it begin to draw, to pull, to feed. And then something extraordinary happened. The curse found nothing to latch onto. It was like trying to grasp smoke, like attempting to drain an empty well. Thomas's life force, whatever made him him, was there, she could feel it, but it was somehow untethered, uncatchable. The curse searched desperately, frantically, trying to find purchase, trying to establish the connection it needed to feed. But Thomas existed in the spaces between awareness, in the blind spots of perception. He was a ghost made flesh, present but ungraspable. And the curse could not feed on what it could not fully perceive. Seraphine felt the magic falter. For the first time in 400 years, felt it stumble and fail. The vortex collapsed. The hunger receded. And suddenly, impossibly, she was simply kissing him. Not draining him. Not killing him. Just kissing, lips on lips, breath mingling with breath, warmth meeting cold. She gasped against his mouth, shock and disbelief and something dangerously close to joy flooding through her. Her eyes, which had been clenched shut, flew open, and met his. Gray on crimson. Human on inhuman. And he was smiling. Smiling even as red mist began to seep from her lips, visible manifestations of the curse's magic being expelled, repelled, broken. Thomas was still alive. The curse was failing. Seraphine pulled back, breaking the kiss, her entire body trembling. She stared at him in wonder, watching the rise and fall of his chest, the color in his cheeks, the life that still blazed in his eyes. Alive. He was alive. And She looked down at her hands and saw golden light beginning to emanate from her pale skin. Not the cold crimson of her curse, but something warm, something that felt like dawn after an endless night. The red mist that had been pouring from her lips swirled around them both, filled with glowing particles, fragments of broken magic, pieces of a curse coming undone. Thomas, she breathed, his name a prayer and a question and a miracle all at once. I told you, he said, his voice rough but steady, still smiling that impossible smile. I told you I was different. Around them, the grand hall seemed to respond to the broken magic. The crimson candles flared brighter, their flames shifting from red to gold. The moonlight intensified, no longer cold but warm, almost liquid in its radiance. The shadows that had clung to every corner for centuries began to recede, driven back by light that had no source but seemed to come from everywhere at once. And Seraphine felt something in her chest, something she had thought dead for so long she had forgotten its absence, begin to beat. Slow at first, tentative like a bird testing wings after years in a cage. Then stronger, steadier. A heartbeat. Her heartbeat. Human and real and impossible. The curse was breaking. Not just failing but shattering completely, undone by the one thing it had never accounted for. Someone who existed in the margins, who slipped through the cracks of reality, who was too forgotten to be fully grasped. Thomas's peculiar curse had been the key to her freedom all along. She kissed him again, and this time there was no activation, no hunger, no drawing of life force. There was only the kiss itself, tender and tentative and absolutely, perfectly ordinary. The kind of kiss humans shared every day, unremarkable and yet more precious than anything she had experienced in her long, cursed existence. When they finally broke apart, tears were streaming down Seraphine's face. She hadn't cried in 4 centuries, hadn't been able to, her body too dead for such human responses. But now the tears flowed freely and they were warm and they were real. Thank you, she whispered against his lips. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You're welcome, Thomas said and laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy. Though I have to admit, I wasn't entirely sure that would work. I had maybe a 60% confidence level. 60%? Seraphine pulled back to stare at him in horror. You bet your life on 60% odds? Well, when you put it that way, it does sound a bit reckless. He grinned. But I had a good feeling about it. And besides, the alternative was watching you suffer forever. I couldn't do that. The golden light surrounding them was growing stronger now, pulsing in rhythm with Seraphine's newly restored heartbeat. The red mist, the physical manifestation of her curse, was dissipating, breaking apart into smaller and smaller particles that caught the light like crimson snow. Where the particles touched the floor, the black stone seemed to lighten, color returning after centuries of magical corruption. Where they touched the walls, the shadows fled. Where they touched Seraphine herself, she felt warmth spreading through her undead flesh, life returning to limbs that had been cold for so long. The transformation took hours. Dawn came, and for the first time in 400 years, Seraphine did not have to retreat from the light. She stood on the balcony of the grand hall with Thomas beside her, watching the sun rise over the sea of sorrows, feeling its warmth on her face without pain, without burning. The curse had protected her from the sun as much as it had isolated her from humanity. Now, with the curse broken, she was vulnerable again, but she was also free. Her skin, which had been porcelain pale and cold, took on color as the day progressed. Faint at first, just a hint of pink in her cheeks, but growing steadier as her heart continued its hesitant beating. Her eyes, which had glowed crimson for so long, began to shift, the red fading to something softer, more natural. Not fully human yet, perhaps never fully human again, but no longer the eyes of a predator. Her fangs remained, but they ached in a way they never had before, as if her body wasn't sure whether to keep them or shed them like baby teeth. How do you feel? Thomas asked, watching her with concern and wonder. Strange, Seraphine admitted. Wait. But also, more alive than I've felt in centuries. My body is remembering how to be human, and it's painful and awkward and absolutely wonderful. They spent that day together, exploring what her freedom meant. Seraphine ate food for the first time in 400 years, simple bread and cheese that Thomas prepared, and wept at the taste of it, at the way her stomach accepted and digested it, at the ordinary magic of hunger and satisfaction. She slept, truly slept, for the first time since her death, and dreamed confused dreams of her old life, memories that had been locked away by the curse suddenly accessible again. When she woke, Thomas was sitting beside her bed, reading a book by candlelight, keeping watch. He looked up when she stirred and smiled, that same quiet, unremarkable smile that had somehow saved them both. "I remembered something," Seraphine said, her voice rough from sleep and emotion. "My name. My real name from before the curse. I was Seraphine Ashford. I was the daughter of a merchant. I was 23 years old when I died." "Hello, Seraphine Ashford," Thomas said gently. "I'm Thomas Gray. It's nice to meet you." She laughed and cried at the same time, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of being introduced as a person rather than a monster. They talked through the night again, but this time Seraphine could offer details about her life, memories that had been hidden beneath layers of curse and trauma. She had been an artist, she remembered. A painter. She had been in love once with a young man whose name was lost to time. She had laughed easily and danced at festivals and eaten sweet cakes from the baker on the corner. The curse had stolen all of that, had buried it beneath centuries of isolation and hunger. But now, with Thomas's help, she was excavating her own history, reclaiming the person she had been before the darkness took her. "What about you?" she asked when she had told him everything she could remember. "You said people forget you, but surely someone must remember something. Your parents? Siblings?" Thomas's expression grew distant. "I had a sister once, younger than me by 3 years. She used to be the only one who could always find me, even when everyone else forgot I was there. We were close." He paused, pain flickering across his face. "She died when she was 15. Fever. After that, there was no one left who could anchor me in their memory. I became truly forgettable. I'm so sorry. It was a long time ago." Thomas shrugged, but the gesture was too casual, too practiced. "I've made peace with it. Or I thought I had until I met you. Now I'm wondering if maybe I'm supposed to be your anchor. The person who remembers you. The one who can see you clearly when no one else can." Seraphine reached out and took his hand. A simple gesture, but one that would have been impossible just a day ago. His skin was warm against hers and she could feel the pulse in his wrist, strong and steady and alive. "Then we'll anchor each other," she said. "I'll remember you and you'll remember me, and maybe between the two of us, we'll finally exist fully in this world." It took 3 months before Seraphine felt strong enough to leave the castle. 3 months of relearning how to be human, of adjusting to hunger and thirst and exhaustion and all the small vulnerabilities that came with mortality. Her transformation was not complete. She still had her fangs, still had strength beyond normal human limits, still found herself most comfortable in darkness. But she was no longer fully undead. She existed in a liminal space between human and monster, alive but not quite mortal. Thomas stayed with her through all of it, patient and steady as always. He helped her when she stumbled, caught her when she fell, reminded her how to breathe when panic overwhelmed her. And in return, she kept him anchored in reality, refusing to let him fade into the background, seeing him clearly even when he tried to make himself invisible. They were healing each other, slowly and imperfectly, but genuinely. The first time they ventured out together, they walked to the village of Ashenmere, the same village that had feared Seraphine for centuries. She wore a cloak with a deep hood, hiding her distinctive features, while Thomas walked openly beside her. People noticed him slightly more when he was with her, as if her presence gave him solidity, made him harder to forget. And she found that being with him muted her supernatural presence, made her seem less like a monster and more like a woman. They bought supplies in the market, food and candles and fabric for new clothes. The merchants were wary but not openly hostile. Stories of the Crimson Widow had faded over the decades, becoming legends rather than immediate threats. And Seraphine, hooded and humble, looked nothing like the terrifying vampire of those old tales. "Do you think they'd believe us?" Thomas asked as they walked back to the castle, arms laden with purchases. "If we told them the truth? That the curse is broken?" I don't know, Seraphine admitted, but I'm not sure it matters. I'm not seeking their forgiveness or their acceptance. I just want to exist peacefully without causing harm. If they can tolerate my presence, that's enough. Is this enough for you? Thomas gestured at the path ahead, the castle looming in the distance. Living quietly, anonymously? You're free now, Seraphine. You could go anywhere, do anything. She considered this, watching the way the afternoon sun painted the landscape in gold and amber. I spent 400 years unable to connect with anyone. Unable to touch, to kiss, to love. Now I can. Now I have you. Why would I want to be anywhere else? Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. I need you to understand something. I'm not going to live forever. I'm human, fully human, and humans die. You might be partially immortal now, we don't know. But even if you age normally, you're still going to outlive me by decades. Are you prepared for that? For losing me eventually? Seraphine set down her packages and took both of his hands in hers. I spent 4 centuries alone because I was too afraid of loss to risk connection. I'm not making that mistake again. Whatever time we have together, whether it's 1 year or 50, it will be worth it. Because loneliness is worse than grief. And forgetting is worse than remembering. Even if remembering hurts? Especially if remembering hurts, she said firmly. Pain means we were alive. Means we mattered to each other. I'll take that over numbness any day. Thomas pulled her close then, wrapping his arms around her in a way that would have been impossible before, deadly before. Now it was simply an embrace, warm and secure and beautifully, perfectly ordinary. They stood like that for a long time, 2 forgotten souls holding each other on a quiet road, witnessed only by the indifferent sky. They lived in Castle Dreadmere for 10 years, slowly transforming it from a monument to isolation into an actual home. Seraphine painted again, filling the empty halls with landscapes and portraits, splashes of color that drove back the shadows. Thomas tended a garden in the courtyard, coaxing flowers and vegetables from soil that hadn't seen cultivation in centuries. They adopted a cat that wandered in one day and refused to leave, a scrappy orange tabby they named Spark, who had absolutely no fear of former vampires. Occasionally travelers would come to their door, lost souls who had heard rumors of the castle and sought refuge or answers. Seraphine and Thomas welcomed them, offered food and shelter, and sent them back into the world with supplies and kindness. Word spread slowly that the haunted castle was no longer a place of death but of sanctuary. Some of the travelers stayed, building small cottages on the castle grounds, forming a community of misfits and forgotten people. Seraphine discovered that she had a talent for healing. Her understanding of curses and magic made her uniquely qualified to help others suffering from supernatural afflictions. She could not cure everyone, but she could ease pain, could offer hope, could share the hard-won wisdom of someone who had survived the unsurvivable. Thomas, meanwhile, found purpose in being the castle's chronicler. He wrote down stories, the histories of everyone who came through their doors, ensuring that the forgotten were remembered, that the invisible were seen. His writings became valuable resources, passed from village to village, proof that the overlooked mattered. They grew older together. Seraphine aged slowly, her partial immortality meaning that decades left only light traces on her face. Thomas aged normally, his brown hair gradually streaking with gray, his face gaining lines that spoke of laughter and hard work. He remained healthy and strong into his 50s, then began the inevitable decline of all mortal bodies. They did not waste time mourning what was coming. Instead, they celebrated what they had. Every morning was a gift. Every conversation a treasure. Every touch a miracle. They kissed often, never taking for granted the simple magic of lips meeting without death following. Thomas Gray died on a clear autumn evening, with the sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. He was in his bed in their shared chambers, surrounded by books and paintings and all the artifacts of a life well lived. Seraphine sat beside him, holding his hand, watching as his breathing grew shallower, slower, more labored. "I'm not afraid," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I've had a good life. A better life than I ever imagined possible." "Because you were brave?" Seraphine said, tears streaming down her face. "Because you looked at a monster and saw a person. Because you were willing to risk everything for connection. No, Thomas corrected gently. Because you were brave enough to let me try. To hope when hope seemed impossible. To risk your heart even though you'd been hurt so many times before. He squeezed her hand weakly. Promise me something? Anything. Don't isolate yourself again. Don't let my death drive you back into loneliness. The world needs you, Seraphine. People need you. And you need them. Promise me you'll stay connected. I promise, she whispered even though the words felt like knives. I'll stay. I'll remember. I'll keep telling our story. Thomas smiled, and for a moment he looked young again, looked exactly like the quiet, unremarkable man who had knocked on her door 15 years ago with nothing but courage and hope. I love you, Seraphine Ashford. Thank you for remembering me. I love you, Thomas Gray. Thank you for seeing me. He took one more breath, let it out slowly, and was gone. Seraphine sat with him for hours, holding his cooling hand, feeling the absence of his pulse, the terrible silence where his breathing had been. The grief was overwhelming, crushing, a weight that made her want to scream in rage and tear the world apart. But underneath the grief was something else. Something lighter. Gratitude. Love. The knowledge that she had been seen, known, cherished. That she had not been alone. Thomas's death hurt precisely because his life had mattered. And that, she realized, was exactly what he had tried to teach her. That love and loss were inseparable. That connection came with the price of eventual separation. But that the connection was worth it anyway. Seraphine Ashford lived for another 100 years after Thomas Gray died. She continued to run the sanctuary at Castle Dreadmere, helping those who needed it, healing those she could, remembering those the world forgot. She painted Thomas's portrait 100 times, each version capturing a different aspect of him. His quiet strength, his gentle humor, his steady courage. She wrote down every conversation she could remember, every story he had told, every insight he had shared. And she told their story to anyone who would listen. The vampire woman who had been cursed to kill with a kiss, and the forgettable man who had broken her curse by being impossible to grasp. It became a legend in its own right, passed from village to village, a fairy tale with teeth, a romance that acknowledged both the beauty and the cost of connection. Some people doubted it, claimed it was impossible, that curses didn't work that way, that love couldn't conquer ancient magic. But Seraphine had proof in her own restored heartbeat, in her ability to touch without killing, in the memories that sustained her through the long years of grief and joy that followed. She never loved anyone else the way she had loved Thomas. But she did love the people who came to her castle, the community that grew around her, the world that slowly became less frightening and more full of possibility. She learned that there were many kinds of connection, many ways to anchor oneself in reality. Romantic love was one. But so was friendship, mentorship, community, purpose. Eventually, Seraphine's partial immortality began to fade. Her body started aging again, catching up with all the years it should have lived. She welcomed it. Mortality meant she would someday join Thomas, wherever souls went after death. It meant an end to her story, and she had learned that endings were not things to fear but things to embrace. On her last day, surrounded by the people she had helped and loved, Seraphine looked up at the painted portrait of Thomas that hung above her bed. His gray eyes seemed to meet hers across the distance of years, steady and knowing and kind. I kept my promise, she whispered. I stayed connected. I remembered. And now I'm ready to see you again. She closed her eyes, feeling her heartbeat slow, that miraculous heartbeat that Thomas had helped restore, and let herself slip away, peaceful and complete. The people of the castle buried her in the garden Thomas had planted, beneath the roses that still bloomed every spring despite being over a century old. They carved a stone marker with words that Seraphine had requested. Here lies Seraphine Ashford, who was cursed to be alone until Thomas Gray taught her that connection was worth the risk. May they be remembered together. And they were. Generation after generation, the story was told and retold, adapted and embellished, but always maintaining its essential truth, that two lonely souls had found each other in the darkness and created light. That a kiss which should have brought death had instead brought life. That love, however improbable, however impossible, was always worth fighting for. The castle still stands today, no longer haunted but still sacred, a place where the forgotten can find community and the isolated can find connection. Visitors come to see the gardens, the paintings, the library filled with Thomas's chronicles. They come to hear the story of the vampire woman and the quiet human who broke an ancient curse with nothing but courage and hope. And sometimes, on autumn evenings when the sunset paints the sky gold and crimson, people swear they can see two figures standing on the balcony of the grand hall, a woman with dark hair and eyes like twilight, and a man with gray eyes and an unremarkable face that somehow manages to be unforgettable. They're holding hands and watching the sea. These ghosts are memories or manifestations of love that refuse to be forgotten. The wind carries the sound of their laughter and it sounds like freedom. In a world that fears connection and glorifies isolation, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is risk your heart. Sometimes the most powerful magic is not the curse that separates us, but the courage that brings us together. And sometimes the quietest voices tell the loudest truths, that we are all worth remembering, worth knowing, worth loving, even when the world insists otherwise. This is the story of Seraphine and Thomas. This is the story